Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome into the combat zone, where the enemy only has one of four things to say: abandon ship, bail out, take cover, and we surrender. And we've got lots of news for you guys tonight, in addition to our various topics that Nick and I like to talk about. As our description says on our website, Nick?
Yes?
Whatever comes to our fertile minds.
That's right. Now, you should tell them about the big technological leap we just made.
Well, what we're doing is we're actually doing Facebook Live tonight. So, in addition to being on our website, which we do every week, we have a live player at thecombatzone.ca. We are also simulcasting live on Facebook. Now, we don't have video yet on our Facebook page. What we're doing is we are, help me out here, Nick, come on. You're already responding to comments, right? We're using graphics is what I'm saying here.
Yes.
We're using graphics. But hopefully once we have, Nick pretties up his hair and has a little bit better lighting and stuff like that, we might.
Well, there is a condition we have to meet, and I don't know how we're going to do that. We have to find faces good enough for TV.
Yeah, well, you see, my face is hidden behind quite a large beard, as you've noticed, Nick.
Yeah,
and it's coming in nicely now, I think, right?
Well, it's been, how long have I known you? 10 years?
About that.
Yeah, it's always been there.
No, sometimes I go with a goatee, but I haven't shaved.
I've never seen you with a goatee.
You just don't remember. But I haven't shaved now in, it must be 3 or 4 years anyway. And I've trimmed, but I've sort of let the whole thing go out now a little bit, and just what am I thinking here? I think we need to get into the show. One more really interesting technological announcement, Nick. We are now on iTunes and Google Podcasts. So if your preferred platform is iTunes or Google Podcasts. It's bad enough that I don't have a face for television. I don't seem to have
a tongue for one
either, or even for radio. So yeah, you can get us on iTunes now. You can get us on Google Podcasts, and if everything works out technologically this week, you can get us on Facebook Live every week. So there you go. And Nick, I brought us in, so I think that you should be the one to introduce your first topic.
All right. There is an issue which just drives me around the bend. You see it all the time on, what's the word I'm looking for? Facebook, of course. Where else would it be? And I engage in this, and I should know better, because you can't win. It doesn't matter what you present as evidence. They always bat it aside as if what you just said doesn't mean anything. Anyway, that's the climate change thing. The man-made global warming. Oh my God, the sky is falling and it's all our fault topic. And my position on that is pretty well known. But if this is the first time listening, I don't believe that man is responsible for climate change. I'm not saying the climate isn't changing. Nobody I know says that, because obviously the climate is changing all the time. However, are we driving it? And to me, from the reading I've done and the research and looking into this and listening to real experts on this, the answer is no. So they've declared this climate emergency, and then everything just kind of fell on its face and nobody actually did anything. But up north, in northeastern Ontario, I had the story pulled up. Let me find it. There is a native reserve where the water is so polluted, they can't even bathe in it. And it's like, look, guys, there's 1,600 people in this town. And you know what? If I had the name of the reserve, I probably couldn't say it anyway. So I'm not going to butcher it. It doesn't matter. But the point is, here we have a situation, 1,600 people living in the northwest corner of Ontario. They've been under a boil water advisory since 2001. That's 18 years. There are people who were born there, grown up there, lived with that dirty water all their lives, and then went off to school, who lived there, who came from there. Now, at some point, you got to say, wait a minute. Look, I don't care if it was $50 million. That's a drop in the bucket compared to, and it's not that much, but I think that in the article it talks about $12 million water treatment plant that they put in to give them clean water, but now they're afraid that that will cause problems with their sewage lagoon, and a whole host of new problems will crop up because of that. So just putting in the wastewater treatment system or not the wastewater, but the water purification system isn't necessarily going to solve all their problems. And they've been at this since 2001. Look, which do you think is the most important issue to deal with? Some nebulous maybe might happen if all the computer models are right, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they're not. 80 years from now, well, it depends who you listen to. If you listen to some of the American Democrats, it's only 10 or 12 years. But between 12 and 80 years from now, we all could suffer a 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures. Or this scenario where these people can't even drink their own water. They can't bathe in it. They've been told not to boil it indoors, because if they do, the boiling process will release noxious and toxic gases. That's an emergency. That's something that needs to be dealt with. Not this nonsense about, we got to put on carbon taxes because that'll help save the planet. I'm sorry, it doesn't. None of the solutions people put out there who are on the sky is falling side actually address any real climate issue. They all just go running around trying to hold the sky up. And here we have these people, and this isn't the only place where this is going on. This is just one example. There's the province of Quebec. I saw a map here within the last month. Little yellow dots of communities, and there's dozens of them all over southwestern Quebec that are pouring raw sewage into the tributaries to the Ottawa River. Who gets their water from the Ottawa River? Millions of people. Vancouver's dumping sewage into the Pacific Ocean like it's a toilet. And yet nobody worries about that. It's all climate change. And the reason I think that's happening, and I know I'm ranting like a madman, and I'll give you a chance to get in on this in a second, but the reason it's happening is because it's easy. It's intellectually lazy to fall into the climate change sky is falling crowd, because it doesn't really require much effort on your part. Ride a bike, recycle, which is a joke anyway. We should do a whole show just on that. There's nothing really hard about doing those things. But making politicians deal with these issues, like the filthy water in this northwestern Ontario community, that's hard. Because they're like a mammoth boulder. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to get it going. And then it takes a tremendous amount of energy to get it stopped once they've, air quotes, solved the problem. Okay, your turn.
Well, not my turn. I'm just going to jump in on the subject maybe a little bit there, Nick. And you know what I say, right? Please don't sugarcoat it. Give it to us straight. Look, Nick, you're absolutely right. I'm going to take issue with you on one particular aspect of your rant,
okay,
and that is your assertion that it's easier to do the climate change stuff. It's not. In fact, it actually takes effort for people to do that. Riding bikes, changing the way that you go to and from work. So there's actual physical effort. There are things that you do in order to change your behavior to allegedly save the planet. So in terms of the average taxpayer, I don't think it's easier to deal with climate change. I think it's actually harder to deal with climate change. But who cares about climate change? And by the way, let's make it perfectly clear, I do not accept the theory that human beings are responsible for climate change. I do not believe that CO2 is responsible for climate change. So let's just get that out of the way right from the start.
Okay.
But for the sake of argument, even if it was true that CO2 is causing climate change, and human beings are the main cause of CO2 production. Even if all of that was true, it is absolutely criminal, and it is absolutely immoral if it's not criminal, that we are not dealing with these very real and present dangers now in communities here in Canada. And it's particularly so when we're shipping off tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to foreign governments and foreign entities and helping with third-party advocacy groups, providing them with grants and subsidies. And the kind of money that's going into the climate change industry is mind-boggling. It's astronomical, Nick.
Well, this is part of my complaint.
But not one penny of that goes to helping Aboriginal communities that are under boil water advisories. And typically, dare I say it, Nick, because I don't want to accuse anyone of being racist, but dare I say it, it's typically Aboriginal and Inuit communities that are suffering from this kind of neglect. I think there's a very serious problem here. Again, I'm not alleging racism. We're going to talk a little bit about this racism stuff later on in the show. But I think that there's a serious problem here. Something stinks, and it's not in Denmark.
Well, you know what? There's an element to that. I try not to go there, but it's hard. After a little while, it becomes like if this was a community in any part of the country that was non-native, would the reaction would it take 18, almost 19 years to get it dealt with? And I think the answer is a resounding no. And that is a whole different element that I hadn't even considered into, because to me, I don't believe in identifying people by race. We're all human beings. I don't care if you're Asian. I don't care if you're Native. I don't care if you're black, white, whether you're Mediterranean. None of that stuff matters to me. We're just human beings. The fact we come in different hues and colors is actually one of the great joys in life, is that not everybody looks like me, thank God. So that element never crossed my mind until you mentioned it. But now that you think about it, what other excuse is there? Because nowhere else would this be tolerated.
Well, it certainly wouldn't be tolerated in Rockcliffe Park here in Ottawa. It wouldn't be tolerated in Hyde Park in Toronto. It wouldn't be tolerated in any other community. It doesn't even, I'm singling out somewhat more affluent areas in these cities. But the truth is, it wouldn't be tolerated anywhere in these cities, and it wouldn't be tolerated in smaller towns and villages. Every now and then, there are isolated cases where this kind of thing occurs in I'm going to use the term white. Gosh, I'm starting to sound like the Antifa people. But the truth is, let's face facts. It's not happening chronically. It doesn't happen chronically in any kind of community other than Aboriginal communities. And, we spend so much money on climate change and trying to stop climate change, but we're not actually addressing real environmental concerns. With the one exception, I will say this, Nick, in terms of what does and does not happen in non-Aboriginal communities. You made a point of the dumping raw sewage into various major water bodies, okay? Juan de Fuca Strait on the west coast, the Ottawa River here in eastern Ontario. And again, we're not dealing with these real, clear and present environmental issues today. Instead, we're ignoring them or not dealing with them seriously while we are in a panic over climate change. I don't get it, Nick.
And this is what, like I said before, this is what drives me crazy, because these are real serious issues that affect the health and well-being of people who live in this country on a daily basis. What more of a crisis do you need? Like, why are we worried about... Look, somebody said it today. It might have been Dennis Prager from Prager University. Somebody said that because I was watching some videos on this topic, that if the Earth is so sensitive that 15 or 20 parts per million in carbon dioxide being added or subtracted to the atmosphere is going to send us into a tailspin, then we'd have been dead a long time ago. So why are we worried about something like that when we have something like this to deal with? And I'm telling you, Joseph, this is when I see the stuff that gets talked about on Facebook. We only have 13 years. Oh my God, the sky is falling. I want to hand them a Kevlar umbrella and say, there you go, now you're okay. Can we deal with real issues now? And they always laugh it off. And even when you play their game, present evidence, they look, well, of course, they get their funding from big oil. Well, where does the big green machine get its funding?
Well, I don't get any funding from big oil.
Yeah.
I don't get any funding at all, Nick.
Well, if I'm supposed to get some funding, I sure would like to see that check come through the door.
And this is your invitation, ladies and gentlemen,
to
send us a donation. There is actually a donation button on our website. If you like what you're hearing, send us a donation. But we can't send you a tax receipt.
No, but your tax receipt is the comfort of knowing that you're helping to promote and sponsor an alternative point of view when it comes to the media.
Okay, I was only playing around though. I didn't want to get into a bagathon here. That's not what I was doing.
Please, send this money, please.
I was doing this a little tongue in cheek.
Yes, I know.
Okay, so what am I thinking about here?
That's the end of round one. It's your turn.
Unplanned, the movie.
Yes.
Now, quick summary. First of all, I haven't seen the movie. I'm not sure that I'm going to have time to see the movie while it's playing. I'm going to try to. Hopefully I will in the cinema. If I can't, then hopefully I'll be able to catch it online when it gets released online. But the way I understand it is that Unplanned is the story of Abby Johnson, who was a clinic director for Planned Parenthood. And she happens to witness an abortion, an actual abortion, and she considers this to be a life-changing experience. And from that point on, she becomes an anti-abortion activist, a pro-life activist.
Right.
Okay. So this is her story. That's what this movie is. And it's been like pulling teeth to get it into mainstream cinemas. The controversy around this has been incredible. Why? I don't know. We'll get into a discussion about that in a minute. But finally, they get this movie into some mainstream theaters here in Canada. I think it's playing in 40 locations here in Canada right now, or it's going to be, unless they pull it. And each of these locations now is being threatened, and I use the term threatened purposely, threatened with protests. Now, the reason I say I'm using it purposely is because I'm not aware that any of the protests actually that have been threatened have actually materialized. Because, it's easy to say, we're going to meet here at this place and put it on Facebook. And you know how Facebook works, Nick. You have people responding and saying, yeah, I'm interested in this. I'll probably show up. And then, they don't show up. But I want to observe the irony on 2 points. The first is the pro-choice activists, and there are my air quotes as well. And the reason I make it air quotes is not because they have an invalid point of view. Look, we live in a democracy,
right?
And like it or not, there are going to be competing points of view on a wide range of issues, and this is one of them, and it's one of the most contentious issues. I don't agree with the pro-choice, the so-called pro-choice position on this, but it's a valid position, and they have every right to advocate it. But isn't it ironic that the people who call themselves pro-choice are the ones that want to take away the choice? First of all, I have to say it, sorry if it offends people, but the choice of the baby that's being aborted, none of these babies have choices. The mothers do, but the babies don't. But then they want to take away the right for people to choose to hear the other side of the story. And there is another side of the story. I just have a lot of problems with that. They're not pro-choice.
Well, first of all, if the thing that troubles me, my wife and a friend of hers went and saw this the other night.
Oh, I didn't know that.
No. I chose not to go because I'm already pro-life, and I don't need to be convinced. And it's a hard topic for me to talk about because I have such a vivid imagination. And I don't need that kind of imagery floating around in my head. To tell you the truth, it's tough enough just to talk about, never mind sit and watch. So she asked me if I want to go. I said, you know what, I should, but I don't need convincing. I'm not the person, I'm not the target for this audience because I'm already on their side. Now, there's an argument to be made, yes, but more bodies in the theater, always better to have more than fewer. Okay, fair enough. But that was just a choice I made. But she did go and see it, and she said it was, disturbing on a lot of levels, but she's glad that she went.
Were there any protests when she went?
No. The other thing is that from the pro-choice point of view, the biggest mistake they ever made with this movie is to even mention it. A very famous quote, and I don't know who to attribute it to, but the worst review is no review at all. If they had just let it play, almost no one would have ever heard of it. There might have been a few people go to it. Maybe some churches would have rallied some people to go to it. But in the greater scheme of things, it never would have changed a thing. But this movie has put it squarely in the middle. The resistance to this movie has put this debate squarely in the middle of the public forum, exactly what they didn't want. And so from a marketing, how do we go about making sure, from their perspective, let me rephrase that, from their perspective, what they did was the worst possible thing to do. From our perspective, it was brilliant because it did send people to theaters. It did get them people talking about it who otherwise never would have even considered it. So this was a huge fail from the pro-life, from the pro-choice point of view, and a massive win from the pro-life point of view from people like you and I who want to have the discussion. We're not trying to have it our way and only our way, but let's talk about what it is. Let's write a law. Let's do something.
Okay,
anyway.
So you've just touched on a very important issue from the perspective of abortion in Canada. And that is that in Canada, and most people in Canada don't know this, but in Canada, Nick, there is no law around abortion. Abortion is completely legal, not because the law says it's legal, okay, but because there is no law. There is no law limiting it. There's no law regulating it. Abortion is perfectly okay up until the point in time when the child's last foot leaves the birth canal of its mother. That's when, in law, a baby becomes a person,
right,
and therefore is entitled to the legal protections that are afforded to persons under our Constitution. So there is no law, and the reason there is no law, and we'll get into that in just a second, let me backtrack a little bit. And, I was reading up on this, some of the tweets that were going back and forth, and Carolyn Bennett, who is a minister in the present government, Liberal federal government, I want to say she's Indian Affairs, but I don't remember now.
Carolyn Bennett?
Aboriginal Affairs, Carolyn Bennett. Oh, you're going to look it up on
of course.
On the internet. Anyway, she tweeted that the Supreme Court had confirmed in 1988 in the Morgentaler court case that abortion, a woman has a constitutional right to an abortion. And that is categorically false. The Supreme Court did not rule in 1998 on the issue of whether or not abortion is a constitutional right. On the contrary, what the Supreme Court did, and this gets into why we don't have a law right now, the Supreme Court actually struck down certain aspects, or the Supreme Court was troubled by certain aspects of the existing law limiting abortions that had been brought in by, guess who, the Trudeau Liberals in the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s. And the Supreme Court had some problems with this particular law. They struck down the law the way it was written, but they didn't affirm, or they didn't allege that there was a constitutional right to abortion in Canada. On the contrary, they invited Parliament to go back and write a new law that addressed the issues that had caused them to strike down the existing law. And in fact, that was done. When Brian Mulroney was the Prime Minister, the government drafted a law that limited abortions and created penalties for doctors that were performing abortions. They didn't outlaw abortion altogether. And that passed, by the way, that passed the House of Commons with a large majority, including a large amount of support from the Liberal Party. It died in the Senate. It died in the Senate because it was a tie vote, and traditionally, in our system of government, when there's a tie vote, the Speaker breaks the tie, and the Speaker always votes in favor of the status quo.
Right.
And so that's just a tradition. So the Speaker of the Senate at the time was the deciding vote. And the bill died in the Senate. And there wasn't enough time legislatively to put it back together. And there was significant opposition to it as well at the time, not just from pro-choicers, quote unquote, but from the pro-life community as well, because it was entrenching in law the idea that you could have abortion. And at that time, there was a very strong feeling amongst pro-life organizations that there couldn't be any compromise. They were very much opposed to an incremental approach to ensuring that there was something to do with abortion. But anyway, the point here, the upshot from all of this is there is no constitutional right to abortion in Canada. The Supreme Court never made that declaration, number one. Number two, most importantly, there is no law governing, restricting, reducing, regulating abortions in Canada. There is no law. You can have first trimester abortions, you can have second, you can have late-term abortions, you can have partial birth abortions, Nick. Partial birth abortions. When the baby is actually in the process of being born, as we've already explained.
That's
and in
right.
fact, in Canada, when the baby is, for all intents and purposes, delivered,
Right.
you can still abort that child. You can still kill that child. And most Canadians don't know that. Most Canadians actually are in favor of some limits on abortion.
Right. Now, this is why I have a problem even talking about this issue, as important as it is, because it's in my mind. I can see what's going on, and it is just so. To me, it's such a barbaric act. Now, I'm not. When I say that, I want people, if there's anybody out there listening who's gone through that procedure, I'm not condemning you. I'm not saying you're evil or anything like that, because I wasn't there. I don't know the circumstances. I'm not going to sit in judgment of you. That's not my job. I just know that as a father of a bunch of kids, I find it very, very, very troubling. So let's hope that what we have now is the catalyst, because politicians are some of the last people to come to a gunfight. And it's like, I'm your leader, which way did they go? That's the mentality. They don't want to actually lead. They want to follow the herd where it's going so they can be seen to be leading, even if they're not.
Well, that's too bad, because there's plenty of research, as we've talked about before on our show, Nick, that confirms that politicians are, in fact, the opinion leaders in the country. And that if you want public opinion to change on an issue, then you really have to have the political leaders taking the lead. And unfortunately, we don't have any politicians in the mainstream political parties right now in leadership positions who are prepared to take that lead.
Unfortunately, you're right.
Okay, that's the end of round two, ladies and gentlemen. We are coming up to a break, so lay back, chill out, and we will catch you on the other side.
Okay, welcome back to the Combat Zone. I'm Nick, he's Joseph, and that was a pretty fast-paced first half hour, Joseph. We covered just a couple topics, but a lot of ground within them, that's for sure.
Yeah, for those of you who are trying us out for our first broadcast on Facebook Live, I apologize. I forgot to change the standby graphic during that first half hour. So we now have our proper graphic up that says the Combat Zone podcast with our URL, www.thecombatzone.ca, which is where you can get all of our podcasts.
Including this one when we're finished.
Later on, when we're finished. Or you can get us on iTunes or Google Podcasts as well. And whose turn is it, Nick?
I believe it's mine.
You believe it's yours?
Yes, because you just did the Unplanned movie.
Oh, that's right, I did.
So I get to go to one of my favorite topics.
Okay, just a second. I'm putting my seatbelt on.
You should. I'm telling you, you should.
Okay, let's go.
Okay. Now, the segue into this is Andrew Scheer says he's going to pull Canada out of the UN Migration Pact. Okay. Now, whether he will or whether he won't, he should. We never should have gotten involved in it in the first place.
Well,
that's
we did
number one.
Oh, no, I've got to let you finish first.
Yeah. Because I believe that nation states are the best to decide who gets in and who doesn't. It's just like you controlling your front door. It's not that you never let anybody in, but you want to know who they are and where they're coming from. So that spurred me into thinking about, okay, the UN, in my mind, is the single most corrupt organization on the planet. Everything they touch turns to mud, and I could sit here and cite you examples for half an hour. I'm not going to do that, but everything from Haiti to the Balkans, you name it, it's been one disaster after another. Rwanda, the list goes on and on and on and on. So the question I have for those of you who are listening or watching, is it time for Canada to finally pack its bags and leave the United Nations? You want to lead the world? Do something difficult. Do something hard. Do something that requires moral courage. Leave that organization of tin pot dictators and despotic leaders and get the hell out. Hang up the gone fishing. Leave the answering machine on. Take phone calls that you will never answer and make sure the message includes that. Don't bother leaving messages because we're not going to answer the phone. And you can catch it on the flip side. Bye-bye. Recall the ambassador and the staff and put them to work someplace else because there really is, in my mind, no benefit to being in the United Nations. Now, I can hear the other side saying, well, this is where conflicts get resolved. This is where this happens. This is where that happens. Is it really? Is it really? Every time the UN, if you look at its core mandate to provide a place for the world's countries to come together to resolve conflict without drawing the sword. How many wars have there been on this planet since 1948 when the UN first took its first breath? Now, this is something that Churchill wanted. He wanted a new League of Nations, which was the precursor to the UN, but he didn't want this. I can tell you that right now. He did not want what this thing has turned into. And it got away from its original mandate a long time ago. So it's time that we actually say, okay, look, we've been there, we tried this, it doesn't work, and we don't want to spend any more time or resources on it. Pack our bags and leave.
Okay, so first on the UN Migrant Compact.
Yes.
Migrant Compact.
Yes.
I don't know why I have trouble saying that. I'm a little tongue-tied tonight. It's very bizarre. I don't care whether we pull out or stay in it because it's an irrelevant document.
Okay,
it doesn't lay out anything in terms of law, in terms of guidelines. It just says, okay, if I could summarize it in one sentence, treat migrants fairly and nicely. Well, we do that already. And there are stipulations within the document itself that emphasize, that reiterate that the decisions with respect to immigration, refugees, etc., still belong to the individual nation states. So the interesting thing about that particular document is, as I've said before, we talked about it once on the show, probably a couple of months ago now, it's irrelevant. Why we even got involved in this and signed it, I just don't understand. It kept a lot of bureaucrats and diplomats negotiating and discussing and, dare I say, partying.
Yeah, that's a good word for it.
Into the wee hours of the morning while they hashed out all of the language around this, and all, of course, with great and very important official seriousness. But in the end, it actually didn't do anything. It didn't make any requirements. It didn't set new policies or anything like that. And so my objection to signing it was just completely irrelevant. It
Pointless.
Didn't do anything. So I don't care. We're in, we're out. It costs us nothing to be in. It costs us nothing to be out. So it's kind of a cheap promise to make because it doesn't involve anything. But I agree, you're going to make it as a symbol, symbolically, fine, let's do it. On the question of the United Nations, you've raised a couple of interesting points. One of them has to do with preventing wars or fighting wars. Now, there are two aspects to this. The first is I want to point out how many wars, how much conflict, armed conflict, occurs between member states of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. There's an awful lot of fighting that goes on between member states of the United Nations. The United Nations does not prevent wars. In fact, to the degree that the United Nations has been involved in conflict, it has just as often been intervening in wars, and I would say not necessarily making things better. And it certainly didn't stop the Rwandan genocide from happening. There is a subject for a whole show right there, Nick.
And that's not the only example.
It isn't. But the point I want to really emphasize here is that the fight, the method that's been the most successful since the Second World War for preventing warfare, preventing major wars anyway, has been nation states outside of the United Nations coming together and forming alliances. It's collective security is the term. And the granddaddy of them all was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, okay, NATO, that for years, for decades, stood as a bulwark protecting the freedom of Western Europe and Western Europeans, largely on the backs of the United States, the Americans, largely. And the United Nations didn't have anything to do with this. The United Nations didn't have anything to do and still doesn't have anything to do with collective security in the Far East. The United Nations is not protecting the freedom of Taiwan and Taiwanese.
Or the Hormuz Strait, or Strait of Hormuz.
The United Nations is not patrolling the Straits of Hormuz to ensure that their oil supplies are getting through to countries around the world, including countries that are not very friendly to us, like China.
Well, there's a whole list, but there's another element that's outside the purview of the UN that is trying to lay claim to. And that is that one of the best defenses against armed conflict is the free flow of goods between countries. When you have two democracies with capitalistic systems, I can't think of an example of where they went to war. Now, people would say, well, what about Germany? Well, they were hardly what you'd call a modern democracy, were they? There were a lot of things, but a democracy, certainly once after 1933, is not one of them. So there's no example I can think of. If you want freedom, if you want security, if you want peace, allow countries to develop a democratically elected government based on the free market system, and that country, once you engage with in trade with it, will not go to war with you or with its neighbors because it's bad for business. Wars are bad for business. It's look, when you have a factory blown up and you have to rebuild it, that costs you money that otherwise could have been put into research and development or into stockholders' pockets, all kinds of different things. And yet people keep insisting that the only way is for, some other method. They want to bring in socialism. They want to bring in they want to tear down the capitalistic system. And the UN is involved in this as well because they want to put a tax, I forget what the rate is, on all international transfers of funds. Because the United States has said, we're not putting up with this anymore. We're not going to fund you anymore. So now they've come up with this tax idea on all international transactions, and it would provide them with hundreds of billions of dollars. And if you think the UN's corrupt now, holy mackerel.
Yeah. Now, in fairness, Nick, not everything the United Nations does is bad. There are some things that the UN gets right for the most part. The World Health Organization is a UN body. It does pretty good work. The International Civil Aviation Organization is a UN body. It does pretty good work. But so much of what the United Nations does is not good, and there's a lot of corruption. But the most important thing for the purposes of this discussion, I think, Nick, is to remind our listeners that the United Nations is virtually ineffective, impotent, when it comes to preventing armed conflict. All of the diplomacy that allegedly goes on within the United Nations to reduce the threat of conflict, to solve problems, all of that is possible outside of the framework of this massive conglomerate bureaucracy.
Well, is there anything that you just mentioned that the UN does well that could not be done by some other agency without having to live within that framework?
You're probably right. There's no reason why these agencies have to be within the United Nations framework, but they are. And I'm just giving some credit where it's due. I'm recognizing that just because the letters UN are attached to it doesn't automatically mean it's bad, corrupt, and evil. There's a lot of corruption in the United Nations, but there are some aspects of what the UN does in certain agencies and on certain issues where they've done a pretty good job. But on the big stuff, again, they couldn't be less relevant. It's a make-work project for thousands of diplomat wannabes who don't want to roll up their sleeves, get a real job, get their hands dirty. Okay. That's it. That's just my opinion.
Okay. And with that, we're going to pull that segment to a close.
Okay, round 4.
Last round.
Oh, this is the best one, Nick. We get to talk about racism.
Oh, yes. Let's talk about racism because we
get to talk about alleged racism.
Yeah, that isn't racism, but anyway.
Okay. Well, I say that because, there's been a lot of talk about Donald Trump. And I don't want to get into what Donald Trump's tweets said or didn't say, okay? I could see where people would read them and on the surface go, okay, that's racist. I don't know Donald Trump, never met the man. I'm prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt. I don't think he's a racist fellow. For the people who actually know him and work with him, some of whom I actually over the years have known and met, they've never said anything other than, mostly the best things about him. But that's kind of the way people talk about me too. Mostly it's good. All right. So is Donald Trump a racist? I don't know. I doubt it, but I don't care. And the reason I don't care is because I don't live in the United States. He's not my president. What he does in certain areas may affect policy in Canada, may affect me here, but in the areas that he's criticized the most for, in terms of his alleged character flaws, etc., it couldn't concern me less. It's a domestic issue in the United States, which brings me to Andrew Scheer. And, I've been critical of Andrew from time to time, and this is not me criticizing Andrew Scheer, although I might have an interesting suggestion for him. I want to criticize here the Canadian press. So Andrew Scheer's in Saskatoon, and he's giving a speech, and he's talking about his ideas about energy policy and a few other things to a business crowd. And afterwards, he's speaking to the press. And what do reporters want to talk to Andrew Scheer about? They want to know his opinion about Donald Trump's alleged racist tweets. So, Andrew, and this is where I'm going to give him advice.
Right.
My advice is, Andrew, how about just telling it like it is? Don't know, don't care. He's the president of the United States. I'm running to be the prime minister of Canada. Two different countries, couldn't care less. Okay? If the Americans want to elect Donald Trump, good for them.
That's up to them, yep.
For better or for worse, that's their business, and I'm not going to interfere. I'm not going to be Elizabeth May and Angela Merkel and all of these people making hay out of getting onto Twitter myself and moralizing and showing my moral outrage about Donald Trump. I'm just not going to do it. That's my advice to Andrew Scheer, okay? Now, he didn't ask me for advice. So, so he went ahead. If he had asked me for advice, that's what I would tell him. But I'm not in the game with Andrew right now, so there it is. Look, he answers the question, and he sort of dances around the issue a little bit. It's not acceptable. We don't treat people this way. People's background, their color, their place of origin, etc. None of that stuff matters. Okay, that's all fine. I don't think he should have answered the question, but that's the way he answered it. What's the headline? Andrew Scheer refuses to call Donald Trump tweets racist.
But even Trudeau didn't do that.
Well, I don't know. I wasn't looking at his comments, so he may not have used the term racist, which is, very provocative, obviously. So maybe he didn't. But the question I have is, why are Canadian reporters who are attending a function where the leader of Her Majesty's opposition is outlining his proposals for an energy corridor, I think is what it was all about.
Right.
His energy policy, okay? And what do they want to talk about? They want to talk about Donald Trump racism, as if that has the littlest bit of concern or anything to do with Canada. Now, here's my real criticism of the press in this. Not only is this irrelevant, but they're talking about it because other reporters are talking about it. And this is a perfect example of what I've talked about in the past, where journalists don't come up anymore with original ideas. They're not doing journalism. They get up in the morning, they look and see what's trending on Twitter, they look and see what some of the other blogists are writing about, and if it looks like it's something that other people are talking about, that's what they're going to run with. And it's not just the bloggers, it's mainstream media these days. And so they want to know what Canadian politicians think of Donald Trump. And again, I say,
it's junk journalism.
Who cares?
It's junk journalism. And you're right, we did talk about this in one of our previous episodes, because, look, if the journalist in question was a real journalist and actually cared about his job beyond sticking it to the man south of the border, he would have not even brought that up. He would have pushed Scheer on his comments about the energy corridor. He would have compared them to what Elizabeth May was talking about, because she's talking about the same thing. And like it or not, she will be a force to be reckoned with, God help us all, in the next election. Because he's talking about one for energy. She's talking about one just for power lines fed 100% off renewables. I mean, it's absolutely insane. But, why not challenge him on something that matters in a substantive way to what you and I care about? And I don't mean you and I in general. I'm talking about in particular, but to the people on the street within the country he's trying to become prime minister of. Why not talk about that? Because that requires, I go back to the lazy. It's easier to pick a topic like that than it is to actually think about something unique or something a little bit different on the same topic that actually matters. There's very few journalists out there. Barbara Kay would be one of them, who still does it the old school way. Our friend John Robson's another one. He will dig and he'll come up with a fresh look at something.
Sure, there are a few.
That's what I mean, a few, but they're terrifyingly few, because when you get if you're having a conversation and it's the most important conversation in a room that you've ever had, in the middle of a room, and everybody around you is screaming and yelling, you're not going to be heard. And this is what's wrong. People will they'll listen to the loudest hoot owl. They're like a bunch of sheep. They'll follow they don't think for themselves. They never stop and say, well, why is he asking this question? They don't run it through the old gristmill and spit it out the other end and say, what's really going on? It's just easier to do it this way.
You know what really burns me about this, though, Nick, is that if these people are really concerned, if these journalists are really, really concerned in Canada about racism, about discrimination, I want to know why they're not asking Andrew Scheer for his position on Quebec's Bill 21.
That's a brilliant question.
Because nobody's talking about it.
That's a secular bill.
I shouldn't say. There's some people have talked about it.
Yes,
some people
but
are
not
talking about it. But
not
nobody's
with this kind of
going
fervor.
crazy about it like Donald Trump. Donald Trump puts out a racist tweet, again, allegedly. Okay? But here is the legislature of the province of Quebec passing a bill saying if you're a Christian, you're not allowed to wear a crucifix if you're working in the public service.
Right.
If you're Jewish, you're not allowed to wear a yarmulke, a kippah, if you're in the public service. If you're a Muslim, you're not allowed to wear a hijab if you're working in the public service. Presumably, if you're Sikh, you're not allowed to wear a turban. Now, am I missing something here?
Well, take this and flip it on its head, okay? Take it out of Quebec and put it in any other province. Let's say Alberta, Saskatchewan, okay? Pick your pill. I don't care. If they had passed a law, let's take Alberta just because it's been in the news a lot and it's a conservative province, okay? Or relatively speaking. More or less. If they had passed that law, it would be headline news across the country, and there would be screams of racism. But for some reason, the province of Quebec, the government of the province of Quebec, is treated like a sacred cow and gets a pass on stuff. Otherwise, they never would have put up with the whole language bill in the first place. If the country's bilingual, then Quebec has to be bilingual too. But no one ever pushed them on it. They just they said, no, notwithstanding clause, and they walked away, and nobody ever challenges them on it. Right. You have this mentality about Fortress Quebec. You can't go in there and start turning over tables because we just don't do that in Canada. But in Alberta, it's okay. But in Quebec, they can do what they want because we're not going to challenge them.
Now, it's not, in fairness, that black and white.
I'm making it simple just to make the point.
I understand, but the Quebec government has taken, I think, a fair amount of heat about this, but nowhere near the heat that Donald Trump has taken. But getting to my point is, if you want to talk about a Canadian national politician condemning racism, why would you ask them for their opinion about Donald Trump tweets when you should be asking them what they're going to do, if anything, about Bill 21 in the province of Quebec that bans religious symbolism, that prohibits people of faith from exhibiting any kind of symbols of their faith if they're working in the public service? That, to me, is a relevant Canadian question.
Yep.
And I think that Canadian politicians should be put on the hot seat about it. And I understand that there might be ramifications in terms of national unity. I get that. Nobody wants to provoke some sort of a national unity crisis. But at the same time, you are running to be the leader of Canada, or you are the leader in Canada, or you are leaders in Canada. Surely to goodness, you should have a position on this, because it's an important issue, but more importantly, because that's the topic we're talking about, journalists should be insisting that political leaders present their positions and talk about it. Instead, all they want to do is talk about Donald Trump.
One more point. When it comes to Quebec, if you were to challenge them on the secular law, yes, they'd scream and shout and stomp their feet. But you would not provoke a national unity crisis with Quebec. I'm more worried about Alberta than I ever was about Quebec. Because Quebec is drowning in transfer payments. Their whole reason they can offer a lot of the services they offer, like almost next to nothing daycare, you run down the list, is because the rest of the country sends them, I think the last number I saw was $27 billion a year. If my memory serves me right, there's only 11 or 12 million people in Quebec total. That's a lot of cash, and they're not willing to threaten that. So they're not going anywhere.
Well, it's a good point. It's a good point, Nick. But again, it's not the point I'm making. That's all I'm saying. But
I'm just saying that, you know, there are a lot of people who would argue with the whole idea about a national unity crisis if we ever went after Quebec, which I think is bunk.
Okay, that's the end of round 4, ladies and gentlemen, and it's coming up. Well, it's not coming up. It is the top of the hour. So we're coming to the end of this week's show. Another feisty, frenetic free-for-all.
It always is, Joseph. It always is.
I was trying to find my alliteration there, Nick. All right. So
I get more training to do with him.
Okay. So, again, ladies and gentlemen, check out the website, www.thecombatzone.ca for our podcasts for previous episodes. Check out Tom Harris podcast, Exploratory Journeys, also at www. Well, you can get to it through thecombatzone.ca, but www.thinkradio.ca, because that's our host. And you can also subscribe to listen to us on iTunes or Google Podcasts. And I think that's pretty much all I have to say. Nick, what do you have to say about anything?
I have to say it's been a blast as always. Tom did a great show today, and I never tire promoting his podcast. And I look forward to next week's guest. He had a great guest this week in Robert Lyman. So we'll wait and see what happens next week. But, boy, I'll tell you what, he's really coming along nicely. I really like the way he's handling himself in the air. Okay, and for those of you who are listening on Facebook tonight, join us next week, same time, same place. And if you want the podcast, go over to thecombatzone.ca, and there it'll be. Yep, yeah. This episode will be available. I don't want to say it'll be available in the next few minutes, but in the next couple of hours, it'll be available on the website. So that's it for us, Nick. That's it for me. I've out-talked myself once again. Not. Good night and God bless, and we'll see you all again next week.